All right, so here we are in our last night, last but not least, and we're going to go through several rules that are connected to each other, the last three of which are my favorite.
So let's start with a brief prayer. We're just going to recall, as Ignatius says, how the Father is looking upon us right now. The Father who looks on us with love and delights in us wherever we are and whatever it is that we're doing. Doesn't change the way that he sees us and loves us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So we're going to do 11, 12, 13, and 14. And you can see that the rules are getting longer. So they doesn't mean they need more time to be explaining, but we're not going to break them down piece by piece. So the 11th rule is, let one who is consoled seek to humble himself and lower himself as much as he can, thinking of how little he is capable in the time of desolation without such grace or consolation. On the contrary, let one who is in desolation think that he can do much with God's sufficient grace to resist all his enemies, taking strength in his Creator and Lord. So this is part of responding, or what we're supposed to do when we're in consolation. And this is very important to understand. What does it mean to humble oneself, right? Doesn't mean to humiliate oneself, but as he says, recognizing, thinking of how little he is capable in the time of desolation with such grace or consolation. So merely, for example, remembering what happened to you the last time you went through desolation. Oh yeah, when I was in desolation, I almost stopped going to church. I stopped praying. I stopped going to the sacraments. I might have even stopped believing in God. Okay, well that's a pretty heavy desolation. So when one is in consolation, to remember what happened, so that we don't begin to associate the consolation with ourselves. So the humility obviously is the key to this, right? You can see a giant a lion with a kitten. And the kitten, of course, when it's a kitten, um, feels like it can do a lot of things and doesn't necessarily recognize its size in relation to a lion. So the what, why, and the how are how we are to respond in consolation. So in consolation, the first action is always to accept and enjoy the consolation. So this what Ignatius is saying, like, hey, you have to like think about how you were in the desolation and how incapable. What he means is like, not in the moment when you're in the consolation. When you're in the moment of consolation, you just accept and receive it. You don't like stop the consolation, be like, oh no, 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 no. I have to think about the desolation that's coming or the desolation that I was in. And so I don't I don't get prideful or arrogant in this consolation. No, you don't become afraid of the consolation that is going to make you proud. You just accept and receive. So when does this happen? Yeah, this happens after the consolation has passed. So when you're no longer in the consolation, then you can take some time to reflect and to think, um, in order to take advantage of the consolation. So what's happening is we're adding another good to the good of the consolation. So in the first moment, we're accepting and receiving the consolation and allowing it to fill us and to encourage us and to do have all of its effects that God wants it to have. But then we say, okay, now that I've experienced this consolation, now I'm going to use this consolation to prepare me for the future, right? For what's coming. Why? The why is because if we're careless, right? If we're overconfident, then it's going to set us up for a fall. If we don't reflect on the consolation, then it's going to set us up for a fall. And one of the examples that is used actually is the apostle Peter. You know that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but before that, Peter was with Jesus on the Mount Tabor, where there's a transfiguration. He was also the one that declared that Jesus was the Messiah when Jesus asked, who do the people say that I am? And his other disciples didn't know. And Peter goes, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And then when Jesus tells, hey, all of you are I'm gonna be arrested and tortured, and they're all he's telling them that they're all going to run away, and Peter swears, even I have to shed my blood for you, I will not run away. Well, what happened? Peter set himself up so that when the moment actually came, what happened? He had a huge fall. Thankfully he turned and accepted God's mercy and forgiveness. But what if before then, Peter had uh, been more humble and accepting of the consolations that he experienced, instead of um, promising, that he would, even if everybody else turned away, he wouldn't turn away, and he was willing to lay down his life. If he had been more humble and accepting the reality of, like, yeah, that's who Peter is. Peter isn't the uh, just the guy who Jesus chose to go up to Mount to see the Transfiguration, or any of these other circumstances where he was uh, highlighted for his faith. If Peter had perhaps been more realistic, he wouldn't have fallen in such a state. So the what is humble himself. Why is to avoid fall through careless overconfidence. The third is how. And so Ignatius says that we have to think, reflect, and think. So we are going to look at an example. Hmm. So we're going to look at this example of someone on retreat. Okay. This is going to we had an example like this earlier in the classes of a person who was on retreat. Um, so Jane is on retreat. She's praying 4 1-hour sessions a day and meets daily with her retreat director. So she begins the retreat in peace with a quiet expectation of meeting Christ. She reflects as directed on chapter 55 of Isaiah and is attracted to verse 1. All you who are thirsty, come to the water. And verse 12, yes, in joy you shall depart in peace, you shall be brought back. She is confident the Lord will nourish and refresh her for her ministry. So she's in spiritual consolation. So day 2, in praying over the assigned scripture, come to me, I will refresh you. Jane experiences an inner cleansing and refreshment as if she were drawn into a fountain of fire and water. She was filled with wonder and joy. The blissful feeling remains with her throughout the day, and she experiences the nearness of Jesus as she ponders other assigned scripture readings. So she's still in very strong spiritual consolation. Day 3, she arises early the next morning, quietly hoping for similar experiences of the Lord. She prays over the assigned section of the Canticle of Canticles and experiences a sweet joy at the thought of the Lord's love for her. She then decides to prolong her praying periods from an hour to an hour and a half so as to become more immersed in Christ. She does not inform her director about this plan. She spends 7 hours that day in prayer. Her excitement grows. That night she cannot fall asleep. So what did Jane do? It wasn't a good choice, right? She's she's made a change to a previous choice, even though it's not in desolation. And she doesn't tell her director. Um, so the first, in terms of applying Rule 11 here, okay? On day 3, is Jane trying in her time of spiritual consolation to humble her and lower herself as much as she can, thinking of how little she is capable in time of spiritual desolation when she does not have such warmth and consolation? So instead, what has Jane done? She's accepted the consolation, but then her decision to prolong her prayer times, what is it that she's done?
So are we saying that that's a sign of her pride,
Uh,
like a lack of humility? Is that the
yes,
okay?
yes. And I mean, it's not like she, right? We're not saying she's uh, a selfish person, but she's being careless and she hasn't thought about reflecting on herself in consolation. She's only trying to stay in the consolation itself. She is simply carried unreflectively by the great joy of her consolation. Day 4, Jane gets up with a bad headache, feeling exhausted and under strain. She cannot pray well. All joy has evaporated. She is tired and moody. So now she's in desolation. She's in non-spiritual desolation. Finally, in the evening, she tells the director about her action of the previous day and its results. Now that Jane has spoken openly, director suggests that this was not easy for her. So she didn't want to tell her director because, and this is, I think, a part I skipped over. Uh, she thought the director would tell her not to do it. And so, in that sense, there was an act of,
Like a defiance.
yeah.
I see. So she had thought about when she was praying. She thought of, or she had a thought about extending the prayer time, but didn't want to tell her director.
Hmm.
Okay, yeah. But also, I was thinking too that 7 hours is quite an extension. So even if she didn't have necessarily like a thought, I mean, that's part of it too, but that's definitely wanting to dwell there and not really, understandably. um, yeah, but I was thinking, I was like, okay, 30 minutes or an hour maybe, but 7 hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, I see that.
And it doesn't indicate, if you're praying for 1 hour's prayer sessions a day, you have time outside of that. You might go to mass, you might do liturgy of the hours, you might have exercise. You have moments where you would reflect on or think about the experiences that you've had that day in prayer. But it seemed like she didn't leave herself any. It was all about getting that kind of spiritual high, I think. Um, so the director advises cutting down on her prayer time and resting more. Day 5, she follows the advice, prays less, but still has no enthusiasm and is filled with gloom. Uh, when it is difficult to differentiate between non spiritual and spiritual desolation because she can't pray, but also her perspective on things has changed completely. Um, so, what should we do when we are aware but unable to understand? We should never force a clarity that we do not have. So, if we're not sure whether it's spiritual or non-spiritual, we shouldn't. Um, we don't need to like force a decision. We should continue simply to be aware and notice the experience. As it continues to unfold, this experience will very likely grow clearer. Day 6, at her morning prayer, she becomes very much disturbed. So she went from the highest of highs to the her prayer now is disturbed. So it's not just dry or absent of presence; it's disturbed. She begins to doubt the Lord's presence to her even in the opening days of the retreat. Probably she thinks she should attribute everything to her overactive imagination. She begins to grow discouraged at the thought that she is not meant for deep prayer. Her desire for God is just an illusion. The rest of the day is one of disquiet, confusion, and a sense of discouragement. So now it's clear that she's in spiritual desolation. Uh, so here she's in desolation. The second part of the rule, number 11, says, on the contrary, let one who's in desolation think that he can do much with sufficient grace to resist all his enemies and taking strength in his creator. So she missed the first part of the rule, and now she's missing the second part of the rule because she's not able to reflect that she was just a couple days ago in some very strong consolation and everything was easy for her. Because she hasn't reflected now in the desolation either, she's lost on both accounts. So day 7, director urges her to trust her early experiences. When Jane doubts the authenticity of her spiritual consolation in the earlier days of the retreat, the director is able to reassure her that this was true spiritual consolation. In terms of the paradigm of discernment, be aware, understand, take action. When Jane is not able on her own to reach the second step, to understand her early experience clearly, with the director's help, she is able to reach that understanding and find some more peace. She prays quietly over the passages, rests more, takes walks in the garden. On the closing day, so that's day 8, she returns to chapter 55 of Isaiah. Come to the water, in joy you shall depart. A calm settles on her mind and spirit. She knows that she is loved by God. She also knows at her deepest level that the experience on the second day was genuine. She has become more more aware because of her experience, more aware of her weakness, especially her undisciplined imagination and her rapidly fluctuating emotions. She prays for light and strength to manage these and become more balanced emotionally. She ends the retreat in quiet gratitude. So now she's back in consolation. So why didn't God prevent her from having this experience, right? Here's a woman who loves God and who with very good will has set aside 8 days to pray. Why does God allow such painful and discouraging days? So rule 9 was the 3 causes, right? It's either to bring us healing, to bring us growth, or to prevent us from a future fall. So as painful as it was for Jane, the rules are there, and the awareness would have helped her quite a bit. So we're going to move on to number 12. I'm going to try to read this all in one breath, or maybe Claire, maybe you want to read it, if you can.
But hang on. Let me enlarge a bit. All right. The 12th. The enemy acts like a woman being weak when faced with strength and strong when faced with weakness. For as it is proper to a woman when she is fighting with some man to lose heart and to flee when the man confronts her firmly, and on the contrary, if the man begins to flee losing heart, the anger, vengeance, and ferocity of the woman grow greatly and know no bounds. In the same way, it is proper to the enemy to weaken and lose heart, fleeing and ceasing his temptations, and the person who is exercising himself in spiritual things confronts the temptations of the enemy firmly, doing what is diametrically opposed to them. And on the contrary, if the person who is exercising himself begins to be afraid and lose heart in suffering the temptation, There is no beast so fierce on the face of the earth as the enemy of human nature, and following out his damnable intentions with such growing malice. Yeet.
Yeah.
Jeez.
So, firstly, of rules 12, 13, and 14, um, Ignatius is using obviously on purpose. But these situations that he's using as metaphors are situations of the enemy's actions, but they're not obviously associations of women are not the enemy. So we don't want to.
Is this the one that's maybe St. Augustine or so? I think Father Gallagher talks about this. Is this the one it's that you can also say it like a barking dog, a chained dog?
Gallagher suggests, for example, it could be the parents and a spoiled child.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Maybe that one would be for our ages a little more apt because everybody has seen a spoiled child and what happens when um, you give in to that spoiled child. I think I've seen that enough time with my nieces and nephews, and they become tyrants, and the parents kind of live in fear of whenever this child might throw an episode, especially in public, that they're willing to give in to whatever it is the child wants. So, but if those parents confront the child firmly and their parents are both on the same page on how they agree to handle uh, the spoiled child or prevent him from becoming spoiled, then the child will learn its place and how to respond properly. But so this is rule 12 is referring to temptation. So whenever we're in desolation is when we can expect the enemy to um, be in and out in terms of providing temptations or offering temptations. Um, so Ignatius wants to provide something that will help us deal with the experiences of when we're in desolation. So let's see here. This is also how we could apply the snowball example. If you have a snowball that's at the top of a mountain, and if you stomp it at the top, you can stop a snowball with your hand or with your finger. But if you allow that snowball to pick up speed and size, then the harder it is to stop it, and eventually you won't be able to stop it. Right? It'll run you right over. Um, but we can see though that the enemy, uh, when faced with strength, uh, will lose heart and flee. So the enemy does have weaknesses, right? And his weakness is that we firmly and strongly in the beginning confront and resist the temptation. So as long as we don't um, allow the temptation to take hold, then actually the enemy, believe it or not, he's a greater being than we are, right? He has, compared to us, we're limited cognitively and physically. The enemy has incredible powers, right? He's an angelic being. He's the highest angelic being that was created. And so theoretically, we don't really have any defense against him, right? If there was a fight between the enemy and us, we would get destroyed. But here, if we confront the enemy at the beginning and resist the temptation, then he's going to lose heart and flee. Fleeing and ceasing his temptation when the person who is exercising himself in spiritual things confronts the temptations of the enemy firmly, doing what is diametrically opposed to them. But it also means if we do begin to be afraid and we lose heart, then watch out, right? There's no beast so fierce on the face of the earth as the enemy of human nature. So we're going to look at we're going to look at 3 examples for this, okay? The first is a guy named Steve who is on the verge of being ordained to the diaconate. And Steve has completed 7 years of seminary and is preparing for his priesthood. Oh, sorry. Yeah, he's on the verge of ordination. He has reached, therefore, the moment of final preparation for the clerical state of life. So he's just weeks away from his definitive commitment to his clerical vocation. His preparation includes 8-day Ignatian retreat in silence, with personal prayer and scripture, and daily meetings with his retreat director. So Steve welcomes the opportunity to pray more deeply as he approaches this key moment and willing to prepare for these days of silence and recollection. He is an occasional smoker, and before the retreat decides to abstain from smoking during the 8 days of retreat. So he's chosen kind of like a mild form of penance. He's an occasional smoker, so he's like, oh, I'm going to give up smoking for the retreat. So it's something that's doable. It's not something impossible. So the retreat begins. Steve dedicates himself to the daily rhythm of liturgical prayer and other seminarians' personal prayer with scripture, individual meeting with the director. He finds the silence helpful, enjoys the setting of natural beauty that surrounds the retreat house. He experiences times of peace-filled closeness to God and prayer, overall sense of well-being in the retreat. So he is experiencing spiritual consolation. However, after supper on the 4th day, Steve finds that he has lost his former sense of peace. He goes for a walk, but a vague interior disquiet persists. Man, this sounds familiar. So he's now experiencing some form of desolation, but we don't know whether this is spiritual or non-spiritual desolation. So Steve decides to smoke a single cigarette. So spiritually speaking, is this a good idea or a bad idea? It's a bad idea. Even though on the surface, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, right? I mean, he's only an occasional smoker. It's not like he's an addict. But he had made this proposal regardless, even if it was like a minor kind of penitential action that he was doing. So Steve changes a spiritual proposal that he had in place before the desolation. So that Steve smokes one cigarette during his retreat a matter of life and death? No, probably not. But then he goes to his room for his final hour of prayer that evening, unhappy that he has not maintained his resolve to avoid smoking during the retreat. As he begins his prayer, he continues to feel restless and ill at ease. The prayer is distracted and dry, and Steve, finding it difficult, ends the prayer period after 45 minutes, where he had originally planned to spend an hour. So now he's made two bad decisions. So we can ask, spiritually speaking, is the fact that Steve shortens his prayer this evening by 15 minutes a matter of life and death? Probably not. Steve awakens late the next morning and barely arrives in time for morning prayer with the other seminarians. He continues with the times of prayer as planned, but finds them empty and burdensome. God seems far away, and Steve becomes increasingly frustrated as he strives to pray. So now he's uncertain for spiritual desolation. A thought comes to him. You are about to be ordained a deacon and you wish to become a priest. Look at you. You can't even keep a simple resolution not to smoke for 8 days. You can't complete an hour of prayer as planned. You are unable to pray with any fruit at all. After all these years of training, if you can't even do these simple things, how are you ever going to handle the responsibilities of priesthood for the rest of your life? Wow. Can you see the sequence has now gotten deadly? Here's Steve on the verge of his definitive commitment to the clerical state, experiencing thoughts that directly undermine his assurance of this calling. Can you see the snowball has now gotten halfway down the mountainside? Can you see that in terms of waking hours, this is a sequence of only a few hours, the late evening and the next morning? The snowball need not require much time to grow in mass and speed. What if the evening before Steve had not smoked the cigarette? Would the rest of the sequence have ever happened? What if Steve had smoked the cigarette but had not shortened his next hour of prayer by 15 minutes? Can you see the choices we make in response to seemingly small temptations when they first come have much to say about whether the temptations will grow or not? Wow, that is powerful, because we just finished saying, well, it's not a life and death whether he smokes a cigarette or he shortens his prayer by 15 minutes, and all of a sudden it's like, man, I shouldn't be a priest. In the early afternoon, Steve meets as usual with the retreat director and shares openly with the director all that he has experienced since the day before. The sharing relieves his frustration and doubts, and the director helps Steve discern the spiritual movements at work in him. Be aware, understand, take action. When Steve is unable to reach this understanding on his own, he does reach it with the help of his director. Steve recovers his peace, continues his retreat with his habitual goodwill, and a few weeks later is ordained a deacon, beginning the rewarding year of diaconate and fruitful priesthood. So, a happy ending, but in the midst of that,
Wow.
so much drama in a period of hours, in quick succession. A feeling of unease, decided to smoke a cigarette, shortened his prayer, and then the onslaught of the enemy's lies.
And it came on so, it's almost like when it hit so strong. Like everything was subtle. It was kind of, and then all of a sudden, boom.
Yeah. There's the difference between Adam or Eve Eve responds to the enemy and the way Jesus responds to the enemy. You know, when the enemy shows up and begins a conversation with Eve, it's like she has no awareness. She just begins a dialogue. Did the Lord say that you shouldn't eat from all of the trees in the garden? And then if she had recognized what was taking place and rejected, um, maybe things would have been different. As opposed to Jesus when he's in the desert and the enemy is trying to get him to turn rocks into bread because he's been fasting. The Lord is firm and strong in his rebuke of the enemy. And there are other examples of the saints as well. Saint Benedict, Saint Francis of Assisi. And you can think back of all the examples that we've gone through over these classes. These things always apply. That if we recognize, if we have the awareness and we have the understanding, then all we have to do is take action to respond firmly and strongly to whatever it is that we're experiencing. But we don't do that very often. So I'm gonna pause there, and then we'll do 13 and 14. Is there any questions on 11 and 12?
I have a question. For Rule 11, you were talking about if you're not sure if the desolation is spiritual or non-spiritual, do not force any sort of clarity. Could you clarify that? The clarity
Yes.
part.
In other words, don't try to figure it out. Like
Oh, okay.
don't like, am I in spiritual desolation or this non-spiritual desolation? You'll if it's not clear, then don't try to figure it out. Don't spend your time and energy trying to. You're gonna have to um, let things continue before you're able to recognize, like, is this spiritual or non-spiritual, so that we can respond appropriately. So for example, if it's okay, I was up late last night and I've had the stress of preparing for exams, so I'm exhausted, but and I feel distant from God, but maybe the feeling distant from God is because I'm exhausted, not because I'm in spiritual desolation. But if it's not obvious, then or not clear, then he's saying you have to wait. Waiting not necessarily meaning like be passive, right? Because we don't want to be passive, but we can, for example, what kind of awareness do I have? Okay, yeah, I was up late. I am stressed. I haven't been getting much rest. So yeah, so I can. It makes sense that I would be in non-spiritual desolation. But if I'm not sure, then at least I can reflect on what I'm experiencing.
Okay.
Does that help?
Thank you.
Did you say you wanted to take a break?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just take a 5-minute
So
break.
5-minute break. Okay.
So Gallagher says rules 5 and 13 He said, if you're going to remember anything, remember number 5. Also remember number 13. Between those two, that should get you through most scenarios that you're going to experience. So the 13th rule, likewise, the enemy conducts himself as a false lover in wishing to remain secret and not to be revealed. For a dissolute man who, speaking with evil intention, makes dishonorable advances to a daughter of a good father or a wife of a good husband, wishes his words and persuasions to be kept secret, and the contrary displeases him very much. When the daughter reveals to her father or the wife to her husband his false words and depraved intention, because he easily perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the undertaking begun, in the same way, when the enemy of human nature brings his wiles and persuasions to the just soul, he wishes and desires that they be received and kept in secret. But when one reveals them to one's good confessor or to another spiritual person who knows his deceits and malicious designs, it weighs on him very much, because he perceives that he will not be able to succeed with the malicious undertaking he has begun, since his manifest deceits have been made revealed. This is just a little commentary. I've been reading a biography of Ignatius, and there, during his life, there was a man who wanted to kill Ignatius. And Ignatius, for this reason, petitioned the local authorities to bear arms, because, and the story isn't completely clear, but this author of the biography suggests that this example of Rule 13 is actually based on something Ignatius perhaps had perceived to try, because there was a widow. So this is before, obviously, his conversion. Because if you know the history, like there's this period before his conversion where he becomes a spoiled. He gets welcomed into this higher level of nobility, to be raised at the age of 16 before his father dies. And so he's kind of fed, he's spoiled, he's fed kind of all these grand illusions, and this is where he gets all of his ideas of chivalry, and his idea that he's going to woo this lady of high standing, and all these things. And at some point there was a widow, and I believe she's a widow, and this person was this man who wanted to kill Ignatius. I believed, well, from what I understood anyway, that he was protecting this widow from Ignatius before his conversion. um, but I may have gotten that wrong, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. And so this metaphor that he's using, um, just like the previous one, is coming from his own life. Okay, so never be silent. The enemy's tactic is to keep the burdens that we experience to ourselves. Something probably that we felt like we've been taught or raised somehow as Catholics. You don't somehow share. When someone asks you how you're doing, you say fine. You don't. You're not accustomed to sharing your struggles or your weaknesses with others. So it kind of plays into the enemy's hands when we think that we're called to go through things alone and then not to share things with others. But of course, this is where we also want to differentiate between non-spiritual and spiritual. If it's a non-spiritual burden that we're carrying, then we want to seek the appropriate person who can help us with that non-spiritual burden. Right? If we're anxious or some other form of non-spiritual desolation, then we want to make sure we get the correct help that we need. Also, if it's spiritual desolation, we don't want to just share with anybody. We want to share with someone who's competent and perhaps has a knowledge of these things, who's able to help us. So to be prudent in our decisions. So. So Therese of Lisieux gives us a good example. So Therese, prior to making her final vows, she got permission to enter at a young age, at 15, and it seemed like she'd always been so clear about her desire and her vocation to be a Carmelite. So the beautiful day of her wedding, her vows, has arrived. It was without a single cloud. However, the preceding evening, a storm arose in my soul, like that of which I had never seen. Not a single doubt concerning my vocation had ever entered my mind until then. And it was necessary that I experience this trial. In the evening, while making the way of the cross after morning prayer, my vocation appeared to me as a dream, a chimera. I found life in Carmel to be very beautiful, but the devil inspired me with the assurance that it wasn't for me and that I was misleading my superiors by advancing on this way to which I wasn't called. The darkness was so great that I could understand only one thing. I didn't have a vocation. How can I possibly describe the anguish in my soul? We can perhaps glimpse a little of this anguish. Here is a young woman who has overcome all obstacles to her vocation, has never doubted, has prepared in the monastery for the past years, is on the verge of perpetual vows, and with all prepared for the ceremony the next morning, and now in the silence of this evening, understands that she never was called, that she was misleading her superiors. Therese says, it appeared to me from the devil. She names its origin with equal clarity, that if I were to tell my novice mistress about these fears, she would prevent me from pronouncing my vows. You see how the enemy doesn't want her to say anything? Therese sees herself approaching the novice mistress, asks her to speak, sees the novice mistress agree, sees them find a quiet room, sees herself share this new certitude that she is not called, sees the novice mistress gently nod in agreement and tell her that if this is the case, we'll cancel the ceremony for tomorrow. That your family know and set things in motion so that you can return home. So this is what's going on in her head, right? If you talk about this with your novice mistress, it will be unbearably painful. It will be the death of all you've ever hoped for vocationally. And still, I wanted to do God's will and return to the world rather than remain in Carmel and do my own will. So what does she do? She goes to the novice mistress anyway. I made the novice mistress come out of the choir. The choir is the place of common prayer for the community. Here's the youngest member of the community, whom all know to be on the verge of vows, in full sight of all, in obvious distress, asking the novice mistress to speak. The sisters will not find it difficult to guess that vocational struggles may be involved. But if Therese is to speak with her novice mistress this evening, this is her last opportunity. Within minutes, the novice mistress will retire to her room until the next morning. Therese is shown here to be a woman of courage and filled with confusion. So she says to her novice mistress, I told her the state of my soul. Fortunately, she saw things much clearer than I did. She completely reassured me. So her mistress is a wise and competent spiritual person. She's probably seen many times with such struggles in the imminence of vows, knows Teresa well, and has no difficulty in reassuring Therese of the authenticity of her vocation. My doubts left me completely as soon as I finished speaking. So more drama, right? On the eve of her making her vows. So she's tempted, not as she tempted not to tell the mistress, she's tempted to think that if she does tell the mistress, it's going to be worse. So the enemy is not just telling her to be quiet, but he's trying to say, well, if you don't be quiet, there's going to be consequences. So he works to discourage the sharing. So we can see some of the things that the enemy can come up with in order to convince us if we're not aware. So the one thing is not to share, but some of the things that he can say, for example, is, I could speak with my director, but she is too busy. Yeah, we can think that, but we shouldn't be the one to decide whether that person has time to meet us or not. So if we have a spiritual director, or we have a spiritual person like a priest or a campus minister that we can go to, if we're tempted to think, oh, that person's too busy, well, if they are too busy, then let them decide. So don't let that become an obstacle, thinking that the other person is too busy. They may or they may not be, but they can decide that for themselves. And maybe they can point you to someone else who has time to listen to you. And it's not necessarily, if you look at the example of Therese, it's not like it takes 5 hours to deal with it. As Therese mentions what's going, the novice mistress has been through this with other ladies before. And it's like, oh yeah, this is just a tactic of the enemy. Done. That's enough to lift the burden of the consolation, of the desolation and the lie. So we might say we're too busy. So that might be true, but for how long are we going to be busy? If you keep Rule 13 in mind, then you're always going to be busy. There's always going to be, the enemy will always find something for which you to be busy about, so that you won't take the time to actually share what you're going through. If I talk about my situation, the director person will laugh at me. This is an imagined scenario. People who are in spiritual direction, or have our spiritual persons, are probably not inclined to laugh, because they have a deep reverence for people sharing their spiritual experiences. So don't, because this is just in the imagination, right? We're imagining that they're going to laugh at us. Do we have any evidence that they might laugh at us? No. Unless it's me, then yeah, maybe. I don't. Just kidding. I wouldn't laugh at you. If I talk about this, the person will never understand. Um, well, if you're talking about your neighbor or your best friend, well, I don't know, they might not understand. But anybody that has a spiritual sense, and especially if they're in a position of ministry, um, and when I say ministry, I mean like as a pastoral ministry. I don't mean just necessarily uh, leading a Bible study or something, but that they work with people in spiritual situations, then they should have um, uh, an understanding of basic spiritual uh, realities. Um, Another law, he says, if I talk about this, they will be kind about it, but will never respect me in the same way. Um, you can see that the excuses are kind of getting more elaborate. First, it was they'll laugh at me, then they won't understand me, and now they're not going to respect me. Um, People who are competent will will reverence the courage that you have in order to share what you're going through. Um, if I talk about this, they will gently reply that it is part of your life and that is who you are. Then we can no longer work together. Um, in other words, for example, if you're someone who experiencing doubts, and and maybe this is a little more easier to imagine, someone that has been working with you, maybe as a campus minister or a small group leader or someone that you've known for some time. Um, the idea is that they won't want to work with you because you're experiencing doubt, because you're experiencing confusion. But of course, anybody that I mean, maybe there's examples of people who have done that. I don't know, but I think it's playing upon our imagined vulnerability. You know, they're going to laugh at me. They're going to not understand me. They're going to not respect me. They're going to uh, reject me. Right? These are kind of like fears that we have. Uh, and the last one I think is, what's the point of talking about this? There's nothing anyone can say that will change things. Um, and I think this is probably the one of the deadliest ones. It's somehow, well, what are they going to do about it? Well, I mean, I don't know if you've experienced any time having a burden, even sharing it with someone you don't know. Like maybe you sat on the bus before and someone starts talking to you and they're like just sharing their life with you. And you're like, why are they doing this? Well, because they feel better when they do it, even if they don't know you and you're a complete stranger. Um, even even if the person can't do anything about it, sharing the struggle, sharing the burden is enough to alleviate. And of course, if the person is competent, then they can um, help you put the burden into words and explain what you're going through, so that it's not a personal failing of yours that you're doubting, or that you have confusion, or that you're questioning whether you should go back to the seminary or
Huh.
not. Okay. There's the enemy's words. Too busy. I'm too busy. They'll laugh at me. They won't understand me. They won't respect me. We can no longer work together. I think the enemy is playing upon our feeling of embarrassment, right? If I share, I don't want to share this because I feel embarrassed. Okay, so here we are, Rule 14. Hope where there is least hope. what are we saying here? Well, likewise, the enemy conducts himself as a leader, intent upon conquering and robbing what he desires. For just as a captain and leader of an army in the field, pitching his camp and exploring the fortifications and defenses of a stronghold, attacks it at the weakest point, in the same way the enemy of human nature, roving about, looks in turn at all our theological, cardinal, and moral virtues, and where he finds us weakest and most in need for our eternal salvation, there he attacks us and attempts to take us. So this is also coming from Ignatius's own life, both as a defender of a fortress, but also as a soldier having to identify and recognize the weak points in a fortress as well. So let's see here. So this idea of the enemy looking at all our theological, cardinal, and moral virtues, what is he talking about? He's talking about our spiritual life. Where are the weaknesses in our spiritual life? Is it that we don't pray every day? Is it that we don't go to confession very often? Is it that we're not patient? Is it that we're not very charitable? Are we selfish? So the enemy looks at our entire spiritual life and finds that area where we're weakest. And we might think, oh, I wish I didn't have this weak point. Well, obviously there's no shame in having a weak point, but we have to know what the weak point is, because our defenses are only as strong as the weakest point. So we might be somebody who's very humble. We might be somebody who's very chaste. We might have like some very outstanding virtues and qualities about us. But if we're lazy, or I think lazy would be a good one, because it's not something like, oh, it's not that big deal. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm not breaking really any of the 10 commandments. But I tend to be lazy when it comes to responding right away to spiritual situations in my life. Whether that's a relationship, that's starting to become unhealthy, and I'm lazy in doing something about it, or I allow other things to become more important than my spiritual practices. Whatever that weak point is, our defenses are only as strong as the weakest point. But it also means we can strengthen the weak point if we know what it is. We don't. Once we become aware, once we know ourselves enough, then we build up and strengthen that weak point, so that it's no longer a place where the enemy can get a foothold. So ways of identifying what our weak point is. Number one, are there situations that frequently discourage me, that frequently strip me of spiritual energy? So frequently, is it the same thing that like gets me every time, and very often? So for example, we could be in consolation, things could be going well for us, and then something happens. and it happens all the time. And it's like, it discourages us so easily and consumes all of our energy. Are there circumstances in which I often become afraid? So the first one is frequently discouraged. The second one is often become afraid. So afraid in my relationship with God. Afraid that he's not going to be there. Afraid he's not going to fulfill the promise afraid that he's not going to provide. Are there circumstances in which I often become worn out, tired, worn down spiritually? I think this can apply to people who are in ministry and you're always ministering to needy people and it drains you. But if I want to use an example, so a couple weeks ago there was a little girl that was dying, and I was spending some time with a family. But there was a family friend, and they'd only been friends for maybe a year, and this family friend was spending an awful lot of time with them. Partly mostly because she was in the medical field, but she's also going through school. She had exams, very important exams for her certification as a nurse practitioner, and she wasn't doing the studying that she was supposed to because she was spending time with this family. And that was a situation where I was like, man, just thinking about her doing that, that was making me exhausted. Like I couldn't believe that this person was investing so much. Now, in the end, that situation turned out for good, but there can be situations where uh, it's just asking too much of ourselves that we don't have. Are there situations which I feel spiritually helpless, with the sense that I can't avoid this, I'm going to fail, I'm helpless? That's going to be a weak point. It's going to be a place where the enemy is going to go back time and time again. Is there one recurring way in which I found myself spiritually weakened? Recurring, one way that I can identify as standing out, repeating more often than others, and more debilitating. For me, that would be meeting individually with people with the same scenarios. So here at the charismatic center, everybody thinks they're possessed. So everybody wants an exorcism. Well, I mean, you can meet with that person once and try to communicate with them like, hey, I met with you, I listened to you, we prayed together, and you're still being attacked. Um, Perhaps you're not being attacked. Perhaps you might be better served by seeing a therapist. Um, and they're like, no, Father, there's demons are attacking me. I'm like, well, I don't know. Are there other prayers that we can do? Like, what more spiritually can we do other than that we've already done? So those kind of situations for me easily become debilitating. Um, and if there's a lot of them, then obviously I recognize there's only so many that I can see, and so many times that I can see them. So, does one thing seem to diminish most of my energy to love and serve others? This is to say, life is going on, my spiritual practices are in place, and this happens, and all my spiritual energy fails. I sit in my room feeling like I can't do this anymore. I'm not sure of an example of that. Um,
Can you repeat that, please?
so the weak point is there one thing is there one thing that seems to diminish most of my energy to love and serve others? And this is life. So life is going on. My spiritual practices are in place. So I'm going to school, I'm working, I'm praying, and then something happens and all my spiritual energy fails. I sit in my room feeling like I can't do this anymore. Um, so this could be spiritual or non-spiritual, right? If I fail a test, well, I'm the kind of person that's kind of, well, not me, but I'm not a perfectionist. I can live with some failures somewhat. Um, but I mean, in school, not in other parts of my life.
I like how you keep clarifying.
Uh, so, a phone call from my mother, or from some family drama. Phew, there goes all of my spiritual energy. Another weak point is there's something that habitually disheartens me in prayer. Maybe it's recognizing your weakness. Um, for example, you're somebody who cusses, and when you remember how much you cuss, you get disheartened. Disheartens your prayer, or if you get distracted in prayer, and you like, whenever you try to pray, you're always thinking about something else, and that disheartens your prayer. That makes it hard for me to approach God with joy, with openness. Another weak point is there's something that causes me to doubt God's love for me. That's a big one, right? Yeah, obviously, if there's things that cause to doubt God's love for me, yeah, I'd say that's going to be weakness number one that the enemy is going to go after. Of course, unless you have vices already. Is there a repeating pattern of these experiences? So we'll finish with one example about this rule. And there's this Irish man uh, who has very little education. Uh, when he was 12, he left school. He began to work as a messenger boy for a firm of wine merchants, and the following year he was a complete alcoholic. For the next 15 years, he lived an alcoholic's life, spending his wages at the pubs and then begging, pawning, and doing whatever he could to obtain the alcohol his body craved. So from a very young age. So you can imagine this would be very difficult to overcome. A very visible vice. Uh, when he's 28, when he had no money, he stood outside the pub as his friends entered, hoping that someone would invite him in for a drink. None did, either because they did not care or they pitied that what he had become. He went home to his mother and told her that he was going to take the pledge, a promise to abstain from alcohol. She told him not to take it unless he meant it. He took the pledge for 3 months, then 6, then for life. From that day, he never touched a drop of alcohol. But it was a bitter struggle. He knew that he was too weak to be on the streets where the pubs awaited. He also knew that he needed a place where he could find strength. He began attending Mass in the early morning before work. When work was finished, he returned again to church. He stayed in church for several Masses on Sunday. And this man, desperate for God's help, attempted to pray, while every cell in his body cried out for alcohol. Again and again, he made this prayer: Lord, in your mercy, give me the gift of prayer. Slowly, prayer grew less painful. Gradually, it became easier and then began to draw him. Finally, it transformed him. He sought the help of a priest who guided him in his efforts. This laborer in a timber yard, who had so little education, began reading spiritual books. Slowly, painstakingly, he read the Bible, the Confessions of St. Augustine's, the writings of St. Francis de Sales, and others. Matt knew that he could not hope to deny his body alcohol if he allowed it all else it desired. So he began a life of strict penance. He simplified his food. He observed the fast of the church and more. He slept on a wooden plank with a block of wood for a pillow, and he adopted the instruments of bodily penance found on him at his death. His fellow workers knew him simply as a quiet man and a good worker, ready to help others. His full story was discovered only after his death, and it remains an inspiration for thousands. This man who knew his weakest point, he built his whole spiritual life on strengthening the weakest point and made him a saint. And this is the hope and gift of Rule 14. So this is where the hope, where there's least hope, because the least hope is our weakest point. But even there at the weakest point, God provides what we need in order to strengthen even what is weak. So that is the end of the 14 rules of the first week.
Wow. I think it's interesting how, at least for me, I think we have talked about this, is that we just, I don't know, what am I trying to say? I think that it's important that we strive to continue to have this view of ourselves as the Lord sees us, which is not the easiest to achieve or maintain. But I think I don't know. I think it's so easy to forget how um, how the Lord loves us and how others love and care for us, because then that's where the lies come in, right? Of like, this person's too busy, they won't have time for me, or they're going to make fun of me. I think it's easier to not necessarily give or be harder on ourselves, not give God or people that He sent us the benefit of the doubt.
I think that we either we become cynical about ourselves because we know ourselves, or we um, what's the word? We're in denial. So either we feel like we know ourselves so well that we could never imagine God loving us, much less loving ourselves, or we're in denial about who we actually are. You know, I like we have those sins that we do, but we think that like God doesn't see them or know them, and we don't even acknowledge them because we're somehow we think that we can hide them or not reveal them to God.
Well, it's embarrassing, right? Like we talked about, like it's embarrassing, and I think that a lot of that goes into the pridefulness. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I'm like that. Um, or I must be a disappointment to God. Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah, because well, for Gallagher and Ignatius is these rules are about obtaining freedom, right?
Right,
Freedom from all those things that hamper us or prevent us from living our lives as beloved sons and daughters. You know, um, so the more that we're able to, because the son and daughter is the one who can trust completely in their uh, in their father, so there's nothing to hide. Um, and so even if they do uh, fall or whatever, they have no problem going to the Father asking for mercy, even if it's 1,000 times.
right. Like I've done it again, and he's like, I know,
I know, I was there.
I was there. I saw it happen. Thanks for coming. What are your thoughts, Neha?
There's so many thoughts.
It's so
Um,
it's a lot.
it's a lot. Yeah, I think I really struggle with Rule 13, especially lately, because all the examples were kind of the thoughts that I've had in my mind. So it was a good calling out. Yes. I'm just sitting with that now, thinking, okay, God, where do I go now? um, I did have a question for this the experiences that we were just talking about. Could you repeat the one that you said about recurring, something recurring?
From 14,
Yes.
the repeating pattern of experiences, or the is there one recurring way in which I find myself spiritually weakened?
Ah, yes. That one.
So recurring, so it happens over and over again. One way that I can identify as standing out, repeating more often than others, and more debilitating.
Okay.
For something, for me, for an example, that might be um, the death of a child in ministry. Whenever I have to, whenever a child dies, it's so difficult because it's like, what is there to say? Just to be present with the parents. Um, so it might not happen very often, but um, it weakens. So yeah, it's a kind of experience that can weaken your faith because you're like, why is God letting this happen? And I guess any sort of tragedy where a young person dies or whatever.
And I think too, like for me, it's, I mean, it doesn't even have to be so tragic, right? You know, um, just in like when you put your trust in someone, or, put your trust in, like in the church, for
Yeah.
example, right? And then something happens, or bishop says something,
Yeah.
or a priest, and then you're just, that could be for me, something just that, so I have to protect myself and realize, like, because it can be, I think, in ministry too, and in fact, I think pretty much in a lot of what we do, especially if we're working with people, like, I was thinking of you, Neha, and how you want to serve and work with children, with, speech, would I say speech disorders? Is that what I would say? Yeah, and then Lanisha, and how you want to work with children as well. That there's like, because of that service, when something doesn't go right, or we put our trust in someone who is above us or something, and they're not defending or stepping in or seeing what we see, then it can be very easy to be like, why am I doing this? What am I doing this for?
Hmm.
Does that kind of make sense? So then, like, it's like the powers that be, quote unquote, don't see what we see. Whether it's rules or laws, or, etc. So yeah, it doesn't even have to be that tragic, unfortunately.
Could be like a college student stopped going to mass, or someone stopped going to small
Yeah,
group.
yeah, it
Mhm.
can. Yeah,
I mean, that never happened to me when I was in campus ministry.
it never happened because of you. I think that's the thing, right? We have to remind ourselves that, people are going to be people, and it's the opportunity for us to pray for them. I mean, that's what I'm realizing in all of this as well, is that I don't, what was I looking at too? Was it this? Oh, it was also, the formation for the officers. We've been looking at some different things. We've been looking at in formation, and like, I'm not praying enough. Yeah. So I say that out loud on this video so that
Tell the bishop.
other people can check in on me. So are you praying?
Not enough.
Like, I spend time in prayer with the Lord, which is a good start, but I'm not interceding enough. You know,
Hmm.
like I pray throughout the day, like, be with this person, be with this person. We need your help, Lord. But not like, you know, we used to try to spend time once a week, you know. So anyway, so you pondering there, Neha?
Yeah. I keep
Okay.
when you were talking about that just now, that example, something that I've repeatedly noticed about myself is, I guess it has to do with the awareness part of, I don't pray for what I need spiritually.
Mm.
I'm really bad at that. I don't think I've ever done it in like a solid way. So I'll like notice things that I need to pray about, and then I just don't do it. So,
But that is a good awareness.
yeah.
So maybe we need to meet up and pray together, and then like have other people join in. Well, we used to do the act, like once a week. We need to do that
Yeah,
again.
we
One of the
do.
things, yeah, we do. In the intercessory prayer formation we were doing with the officers, they were talking about how like children of God, children, and children ask for what they want, and there's no like, if there's like a box of all kinds of different treats, they're not going to be like, oh, yeah, whatever you want to give me. Like, no child ever. They're going to be like, I want the pink one that has bubble gum in it. Like they're so specific, and they know, and they're just like gonna ask for what they want. And that was just like really struck me as like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
So to ask and to see what it is that's there, that keeps us from making time or keeps us from asking.
Right. Because it's not as if there isn't time. I just don't think of it. I don't know.
Right.
Weird.
Set reminders on your phone. Did you pray for what you need today?
Big posters in your room.
Sticking out on your pillow.
I actually have a sticky note above my bed.
Okay.
Add to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, any more questions or outward pondering? But I also want to give you time to like personally process. Well, each of us, not just you. Not to mean, I don't mean that to say like you need to go figure this out.
Well, I do.
But to omit us is what like Father JP nor I are immune to, as a reason why St. Ignatius was so into repetition.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That example of this guy getting ready for his diaconate, I'm like, man, that's way too recent.
Right. Hey, close to home.
I've been directing this guy over a week, Neha, who left seminary and is thinking about returning to seminary.